So this is our panel on the 30-year anniversary of Srebrenica. And I'm going to turn it over to our panelists because they're going to run their own show. This is for them, their community, and it's their conversation. So I'll allow, please introduce yourselves and have the conversation as you be the arbiters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I realize it's getting towards the end of the day. I know many of you have been sitting in these spaces for throughout the day. So just maybe a quick stretch, right? Take a breath in and out. But we're really glad to have you. Welcome to the session on the 30th anniversary of the genocide of Srebrenica, which really we want to focus on healing, resilience, and adversity. As I mentioned earlier today, during Dr. Assad's conversation, I really want to acknowledge Tim and the board of directors for Genocide Awareness Week. Thank you for having the theme be around the 30th anniversary. For those of you who may not know me, my name's Nejra Sumić. I'm a former refugee from Bosnia and Herzegovina. In my professional role, I wear a different hat. I'm a senior national field manager for an organization called We Are All America, which is a national refugee advocacy and policy coalition. And just to start off with some statistics, according to the UNHCR most recent figures at a glance, June 2024 report, less than 1%, so less than 1%, of people are resettled to a third country, such as how my family and I did. Currently, there are over 122.6 million people who have been forcibly displaced around the world, with 32 million deemed as refugees, and majority of those are women and children. Many of these individuals are escaping atrocities and genocide. And for some, this is currently happening in this very moment in their countries. And you see, nobody wants to leave their home, right? Everyone knows what home is for them, and they don't want to leave. So for some context and background, I know Dr. Assad shared some of this, but for those of you who are new to this session, on April 5th, 1992, the government of Bosnia declared its independence from Yugoslavia. It was the creation of an independent Bosnian nation that would have a Bosniak Muslim majority. This was opposed by Bosnian Serbs, who launched a military campaign to take away our land and ethnically cleanse Bosnia of its Muslim civilian population. The atrocities that my country and I witnessed were very gruesome. We saw the creation of concentration and rape camps where families, friends, and loved ones were taken to. Our cities, our villages were burned down. Families were systematically separated and taken to camps, systematic torturing and killing of Bosnian Muslims whose bodies were hidden in mass graves and oftentimes thrown off of Bosnia's rivers. And on July 11th, 1995, Bosnian Serb forces took over a town known as Srebrenica. It's a small town located in eastern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. At that time, the United Nations had formally designated as a safe area in that moment. UN peacekeepers were responsible for safeguarding this area, but instead they handed over 8,000 Muslim men and boys. That number could be higher. Jasmin may correct me, but which Serbian military systematically executed in a 2 to 3 day period. This is why today I wear this pendant. Surrounded by the green coffins are the mothers who are wearing white and mourning for their loved ones, with 11 petals represent the day the genocide began, while the white color represents the innocence of its victims. It represents hope and justice and recognition of the genocide. During the subsequent civil war, an estimated 100,000 people were killed, 80% of who were Bosniak Muslims. My family was one of those lucky survivors. My father survived various camps, and we experienced a long journey to resettle to what we call home here now. Till this day, what many Bosnian communities have experienced have left long-term impact on them. And back home on this 30th anniversary of Srebrenica, we are still seeing the impact and aftermath of the genocide. While the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 78-282 on May 23rd, 2024, so last year, less than a year ago, it designated July 11th as the International Day of Reflection and Commemoration of Srebrenica Genocide. However, it did not adopt a Bosnian genocide. The denial of these atrocity acts has particularly hindered our country and our people from being able to move forward economically and collectively as one people. In recent turn of events, which Dr. Mujanovic will talk about, the Balkan has once again is close on being on the brink of another civil war. So with that being said, I want to welcome Dr. Mujanovic to this conversation. And just some background on Dr. Jasmin Mujanovic. He's a political scientist and policy specialist of Southeastern Europe, European and International Affairs, with a PhD from New York University in Toronto. His career background is a blend of global academic and policy engagement, and he has worked as a scholar, policy analyst, consultant, researcher, and writer in North America and Europe. He's also the author of 2 books, Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, and The Bosniak Nationhood After Genocide. Presently, he's the Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the New Lines Institute Western Balkans Center and the Editor-in-Chief of its Western Balkans Observatory. So, Dr. Jasmin, we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of Srebrenica. Can you share what the state of affairs are currently in Bosnia and where we are 30 years later? What, if anything, are we asking from the international community?
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to all the organizers of this event. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Nejra, for also using your time and knowledge to have this conversation with me. I'm going to flag right at the onset a problem with this conversation, which is that Bosnia is often described as being the most complex constitutional regime in the world, right? And the reason for that is that Bosnia geographically is approximately the size of West Virginia. Its population, from best as we can gather at this point, is somewhere in the ballpark of about 3 million people. On the basis of that population and that size, this is a country with 3 different presidents, technically 5, if you want to use that statistic, 14 different prime ministers. It has 2 so-called entities, 10 so-called cantons, plus a special district. Virtually every government post in the country is appointed or elected on the basis of ethno-sectarian identity. So, for instance, this tripartite 3-member state presidency, right, is essentially organized on the basis of ethnicity. So you have one Bosniak, i.e. Bosnian Muslim, you have one Croat, and you then have one Serb, but they're also not elected in the same way, right? So, for instance, if you happen to be a Serb who lives in what's called the federation entity, tough luck, you don't get to vote for the Serb member of the state presidency. If you're a Bosniak, in the other entity, the so-called Republika Srpska entity, you don't get to vote for the Bosniak member. Okay, and then on top of all of that, you also have something that's called the Office of the High Representative, which is an internationally appointed envoy and technically the sort of the premier supervisor of the Dayton Peace Agreement, in which Bosnia's constitution is embedded. The Dayton Peace Agreement is the agreement that the United States brokered at the end of 1995, which formally ended the Bosnian War. And created this very Byzantine and complex structure. As part of that, Annex 4 of the Dayton Peace Agreement is the Bosnian Constitution, and Annex 10 concerns the powers and the authorities of the so-called Office of the High Representative. The current High Representative is a gentleman by the name of Christian Schmidt. He's Germany's former agricultural minister. I will be happy to talk about Mr. Schmidt, but all of this is to say Bosnia is an extremely complex political and constitutional regime. Putting aside all that sort of institutional chaos, as you alluded to yourself, Bosnia's actual day-to-day politics are extremely complex, right? And they are very much characterized not just by sort of these ethno-sectarian dimensions, but also, unfortunately, by certainly what Bosnians in an everyday kind of sense experience as the continuation of the war by other means. So presently, right now, you might even have come across some headlines because Bosnia is eked through into the headlines, amidst tariffs and the rest of the world being on fire. So right now, Bosnia is going through arguably its most significant post-war political crisis. And this, again, concerns, complex matters, but I'll explain it as simply as I can. The president of the RS entity, this is a Serb majority entity, the Republika Srpska entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the brunt of the atrocities took place during the conduct of the 1990s, during the Bosnian Genocide. A region that obviously prior to the war had a very, very significant Bosniak population and a Croat population that is now almost entirely gone, either through expulsion or extermination. The president of this entity, a gentleman by the name of Milorad Dodik, who's been in power since 2006, has routinely flouted Bosnian law, including the decisions of the High Representative. And the High Representative has these so-called bond powers, which are these kind of almost extra-constitutional executive powers. So, for instance, the High Representative has the power to unilaterally amend Bosnian laws. He can even amend the constitutions of the entities and the cantons. He cannot amend the state constitution, but he can amend the subnational constitutions. He can even do things like, for instance, change the Bosnian flag, which a previous High Representative did in 1998. He can sack publicly elected officials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an extraordinary scope of powers. Now, what happened is about 3 years ago, the High Representative had imposed amendments to the Criminal Code of Bosnia and Herzegovina that criminalized for the first time defiance of decisions by the Bosnian Constitutional Court, and also criminalized defiance of the decisions of the High Representative. It was on the basis of those decisions, those interventions, that ultimately Mr. Dodik was subsequently charged for defying the decisions of the High Representative. There was a protracted criminal case against him, and as of about a month ago, he was found guilty. It was actually a fairly slam dunk case. I mean, it was very, he actually, and this is the genius of Bosnian politics, Mr. Dodik himself actually suggested that he should be charged. Because he wanted to make a sort of political show of it. What he did not expect is that he would ultimately be convicted, which he was. And so the conviction, it's a first degree conviction, so he has the right of appeal. But the first degree decision found that he was guilty. He was given a 1 year suspended sentence, which he can technically pay a fine and not serve the sentence. But much more significantly, he was given a 6-year bar on holding any and all public office in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In response to that, Mr. Dodik basically began a process of sort of piecemeal secession, whereby his government in Banja Luka, which is sort of the de facto capital of the RS entity, has basically sought to unilaterally pull out of virtually all Bosnian laws and institutions, which obviously you can't do that, right? Like Arizona can't just be like, we're out of, the US Constitution without having, like a war, which I would recommend against. I don't know what the sentiment right now in Arizona is. So he tried to do that, or he's in the process of attempting to do that. He's then now subsequently been charged again for a different set of anti-constitutional crimes, or rather acts against the constitutional order. Mr. Dodik is now just kind of hanging out. And he's hanging out for a very simple reason, which is Bosnian state police now have a mandate to go arrest him. There is a European peacekeeping force in Bosnia-Herzegovina as well, which is referred to EUFOR. But both the state police and EUFOR are of the opinion that to actually arrest him would be a high-risk enterprise, i.e. RS police would resist. And then you would have the one thing that the international community has attempted to prevent for the better part of the past 30 years in Bosnia and in the Western Balkans, which is a resumption of armed conflict, all right? Now, to sort of flaunt it in everyone's face, Mr. Dodik has just recently completed a little bit of an international tour that he's sort of conducted since being charged for these anti-constitutional acts. He, of course, first went to Serbia, hung out with the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić. He then very strangely went to an anti-Semitism conference in Israel, where he was briefly asked to leave, and then briefly sort of came back and had this really very strange handshake with the prime minister of Israel, who may or may not even know who he is. He then sat down next to him. Prime Minister Netanyahu's bodyguards then asked him to leave. It was all very odd. And then he went to Moscow. And he hung out in Moscow for a few days, met with Vladimir Putin, and now he's back in Bosnia as of this afternoon. And now we are waiting to see where the situation goes from here. That's literally what's going on. Like, that's a blow-by-blow account of like the last 72 hours, as it were, or the last month plus 72 hours. What I will say, just as a kind of broad point, and to sort of answer the sort of the substance of your question, is that Bosnia-Herzegovina's actual governance, as I noted earlier, is very much characterized by this dynamic of sort of the continuation of the war by other means, right? The Serb nationalist and Croat nationalist camps in Bosnia-Herzegovina fundamentally do not accept, in a meaningful sense of the term, the existence of a Bosnian state. They do not accept the idea that Bosnia-Herzegovina's laws and constitution need to be brought in line with the EU acquis or with the European Convention on Human Rights, even though actually that is explicitly what the Bosnian constitution says. There's a whole side conversation to be had about the ongoing fufara about Bosnia-Herzegovina's relationship with the European Court of Human Rights, because something that sort of completely gets glossed over in all the histories of sort of the negotiations of the Dayton Agreement and this, very, very hardline sectarian political regime, is that Article 2.2 of the Bosnian Constitution, again, Annex 4 of the Dayton Agreement, says that the European Convention on Human Rights supersedes all Bosnian domestic law. And it's a sort of proverbial sunset clause, which no one quite understood at the time, because neither the then Croatian government, or the then Serbian / Yugoslav government, nor actually the Bosnian negotiators really understood how significant that clause was. And the reason why it's significant is that because since 2009, a succession of litigants from Bosnia have sued the Bosnian state at the European Court of Human Rights on grounds of discrimination. I alluded to one of them already, or a handful of them, that, for instance, if you're a Serb in the federation entity, you want to vote for the Serb member of the state presidency, you can't. So you go to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights says, yeah, that's insane, right? We're going to strike that down. Or, for instance, if you're Jewish or a member of the Romani community and you want to be in the state presidency, you can't. That was actually the first case that was brought to the ECHR by Bosnian-Herzegovinian citizens. It was the sort of de facto leader of the Bosnian Jewish community, a gentleman by the name of Jakub Finci, and the de facto head of the Bosnian Romani community, Dervo Sedic. They jointly sued the Bosnian state. And the ECHR said, yeah, you actually, we need to amend this clause in the constitution that says no one except for Bosniaks, Croats, or Serbs, the so-called constituent peoples, can only be represented in the presidency. This needs to be amended. Basically, every about year to 2 years since then, various appellants have sued the Bosnian state at the ECHR. In every single instance, they have won. In every single instance, they have won. The problem, of course, is that all of the legal weight is on the side of those trying to dismantle these hardline sectarian structures, but the political will is not there. Right? The political will is not there because, for instance, why would you, if you are, for instance, Dragan Čović, who happens to be the leader of the main Croat nationalist party in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the HDZ, the sister party of the governing party of Croatia, and you routinely win at most somewhere between 7 to 9% of the national vote in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the elections, right? 7 to 9% of the vote. And then on the basis of that 7 to 9%, you will end up controlling fully somewhere to a third, to some instances, almost nearly half of all public posts, right? Including ministerial posts. Why would you ever give that up? I mean, it's irrational from a poli-sci standpoint for any political leader to do that. So that is, in a nutshell, sort of the core dysfunction of Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitution explained. If your head hurts right now, that's normal. That's probably
Thank you for that. I mean, can you guys imagine that here in the United States of America having 3 presidents or imagine?
I think some people might prefer it right now, but it's fine.
True. Or imagine like certain ethnic groups not being able to run for presidency or an elected seat if you were born in America. Like that's just mind blowing to think about. But in the 21st century, it's happening in Europe. So, which leads me to the next question. You know, you've written some amazing reports and book publications, and clearly we need a revamping of the Bosnian constitution, sure. You know, the Dayton Agreement, which was established to end the war, right? To end the killing at that time of people. So tell us more about your report and how do you envision a revamped constitution?
So just to clarify, as the senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute, I was recently commissioned to write a report, which we ended up calling Dayton Plus, which is a report about constitutional reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, I'm going to tell you something very strange as somebody who just authored a report on constitutional reform, which is that the constitutional reform suggestions included in my report should be disregarded. And the reason I say that is not because I don't believe in them, but it's because there is a kind of little bit of a virtual cottage industry in terms of proposed constitutional reforms and amendments in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And, you know, we all have our own ideas about what would be ideal for any given constitution, whether it's Bosnia, the United States, the UK, whatever. Okay, the UK doesn't have a written constitution, but here we are. The upshot of all of that is that over the past 20 to 30 years, you've had some extremely bizarre suggestions. My favorite one actually was something that was called the Chicago Initiative, which was, I still have sort of struggled to find out who wrote this, but I want to share it with you just to show why I'm wary about the whole topic of constitutional reform in a certain kind of sense. The Chicago Initiative for Bosnia and Herzegovina proposed literally dividing Bosnia and Herzegovina into 4 like squares, right? Kind of looking like parts of the Southwest and the Midwest. Which doesn't really comport to Bosnia's natural geographic borders. It also had the amazing suggestion of renaming the country. And the country was going to be renamed Zajedno, which in our language means together, which is the kind of insane proposal that just, anyway. So more seriously, obviously, this year is the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Srebrenica. It's the 30th anniversary of Dayton, and therefore also it marks 30 years of the existence of the Bosnian Constitution. As I suggested to you just a few moments ago, Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitution legally has to be amended, right? That's not up for negotiation. It has to be amended even if Bosnia and Herzegovina ceases to be what it presently is, which is an EU candidate member state. Right, or rather an EU candidate for membership, right? So it's not just because the EU is saying to Bosnia, you need to amend your constitution. Bosnia needs to amend its constitution because of its own current constitution, right? Because that's what the constitution currently says. that essentially, as I suggested a moment ago, the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights takes precedence over Bosnian law. Now, do I think this is going to happen anytime soon? No, I do not. However, it could plausibly happen sooner than anyone anticipates, partly because of this situation that we have with Mr. Dodik. Because it seems that push comes to shove, he is quite close to his end. Now, how that end comes about, we don't quite yet know. Does it literally happen because Bosnian state police put him in cuffs and off he goes? Does it happen because he fears that scenario is quite imminent and he then flees to Budapest, which is sort of the working theory that most experts and analysts have right now? We know that he's purchased some property there recently. We know that the former prime minister of what is now North Macedonia is already there. Also an internationally wanted fugitive. Maybe they can start a podcast. I don't know. All right. So there's scenarios. There's scenarios that we're dealing with. But what that would theoretically open the door to is very significant constitutional reform in Bosnia, but not constitutional reform of the sort that perhaps you and I would like in our ideal universe. In the ideal universe, meaning full equality for all Bosnian citizens in each part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a rational, transparent, accountable constitution. That's probably not on offer in the foreseeable future. What is on offer and what this report is structured around is essentially what Bosnia nearly had in 2006, which is something that was called the April package. This was another US-backed and brokered constitutional reform packet, which would not have done anything particularly out there, like, for instance, getting rid of the cantons or the entities. Those all would have remained, but it would have streamlined and rationalized a lot of the governance of the system, and also would have, in very, very piecemeal fashion, moved Bosnia-Herzegovina away from the most rigid forms of ethno-sectarianism which it currently labors under. And my report, which you can find online, is structured around the idea of, okay, how can you then essentially update what was negotiated in 2006? And it's to date the only constitutional reform in Bosnia's post-war history that ever went to vote on the parliament and failed theoretically by 2 votes, depending on how you want to count. Exactly. Counting votes in Bosnia is hard. But it got very close. There's no question that it got very close. And so my argument in the report, if you do want to read it, is basically how do you take what was negotiated in 2006, but you update it to reflect the legal weight that has been established and the decisions that have been ruled on by the European Court of Human Rights since 2009. So if anyone wants to, really get into the weeds of Bosnian constitutional law, this report is for you. It's also very much written, the subtitle of it is that it's a policymaker's guide. As you might imagine, I'm very blessed to spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. and, places like London, Berlin, talking to various ministries of foreign affairs, legislators, et cetera, et cetera. They're all aware that Bosnia is a problem, but then you start talking to them about the problems as I'm talking to you now, and people start checking their pulse, looking at the clock, kind of getting sweaty. And so this text is designed to essentially be kind of an FAQ. We're like, okay, here's all the really complex questions, and let me spell it out for you with each of these questions in about 2 to 3 paragraphs. So it's my little sort of attempt, and I'm fortunate to have the support of the New Lines Institute, to just take what is doubtlessly an extremely complex issue and make it marginally more digestible.
Thank you for that. So it's been 30 years, and now we have new generations, right, of Bosniaks, and who are now second generation here. Some even little ones who are third generation, right, and some who are mixed family statuses, right, and who it's shifting the dynamic of the Bosnian community here in the U.S. And so what kind of lessons and institutional frameworks are we passing on to them? What kind of resources are we making available to them? And why is it important to engage them, these new generations?
Well, I mean, the thing that I always focus on, because I do spend a lot of time talking not just to sort of the Bosnian diaspora in the US, but obviously like the global Bosnian diaspora, but also other Balkan diasporas, like folks from Serbia, folks from Kosovo, et cetera, et cetera. And for my purposes, I think the real weight of those conversations is to bring into sort of the political calculus, especially in Bosnia itself, the things that you and I, perhaps living in the United States, or our counterparts living in Canada, the UK, Australia, wherever, come to see as quote unquote normal, right? You and I, living in the Arizonas and Californias of the world, believe it's quite normal and desirable to live in thriving, multi-ethnic, multi-religious communities where if I want to have Japanese food tonight, I want to go have Japanese food, and tomorrow I want to have Vietnamese food and maybe Namibian food, and that's all available to me. And my wife is not Bosnian, and so my kids get to celebrate both their Taiwanese heritage and their Bosnian heritage, and they can be friends with kids who are from Romania and Rwanda, or Kenya and Kyrgyzstan, right? Wonderful, beautiful. And the American political process, with its very, very complex and tortured history, nevertheless, under the auspices of sort of the official political legal framework of the United States, affords equal rights to all citizens of the United States, right? The promise of liberal democracy, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I've been really working on is forcing people to resist and reject that the idea that when you are in the United States, you should, accept, tolerate, and celebrate these things. And then when you go to Bosnia, you should accept, for instance, the fact that kids still go to segregated schools, or that you have a political system that is designed around affording political and democratic rights on the basis of ethnicity. And I mean, I will tell you very honestly, like I have had literal screaming matches with international officials in Bosnia, who tried to tell me that, well, it's just the way that it is, and why can't you accept it, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, you want me to take my daughters and put them in a Bosnian school, knowing that I'm putting them in a segregated school, and you want me to accept that and pretend like that's normal. You wouldn't do it to your kids. Why are you asking me to do it to my kids? And moreover, I think there is something very sort of specific about the history of sort of the Bosnian diaspora in particular. Unlike, for instance, some neighboring diasporas like Croatia, Serbia, even Montenegro, they actually had kind of old diasporas, i.e. folks already in the 19th century, early 20th century, immediate aftermath of World War II, that settled in places like the US, et cetera, et cetera. There was virtually no Bosnian diaspora prior to the 1990s. I actually met somebody here last night whose family emigrated to the United States in the 1970s. And I think in my life, I've met like 3 people like that, right? So the Bosnian diaspora is almost entirely the product of the war and the genocide. And in the span of those 3 years, the Bosnian diaspora, especially in the United States, has become incredibly successful in a very, very short amount of time. Now we can talk all about, there's some problematic dimensions to that, right? Like I'm aware of the axis of whiteness, et cetera, et cetera. Like we can acknowledge all of that. We can talk about that very critically, but the fact of the matter is it is a very successful diaspora. And so what I've said to folks both here and in Bosnia and, our various sort of friends in the international community is the extent of the sort of reform program or reform vision for Bosnia-Herzegovina that I advocate, at least, is that you should have the same political and democratic expectations in the United States that you have in Bosnia, right? If it's good enough for the US, or if it's good enough for the EU, if it's good enough for Canada, if it's good enough for Australia, it's good enough for Bosnia. Or, what I sometimes, when I really like to needle people, especially when I, go talk to my good friends in Zagreb, Bosnia-Herzegovina's constitution, I argue to them, I'm a bigger Croatian patriot than any of you. And they say, why are you a bigger Croatian patriot? And I say, because I think the Croatian constitution should be adopted in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because the Croatian constitution, like virtually every other European Union constitution, affords equal rights to all citizens of the Croatian Republic, regardless of whether they are ethnic Croats, as the majority of the population is, or ethnic Serbs, or ethnic Bosniaks.
And just to add to what Jasmin is saying, for those of you in this space who may not be as familiar, schools are still segregated in our country. And history is not taught the same way. There's still a lot of genocide denial happening, and the way that history is written
Sure.
looks very different.
Just to bounce off of that, right? Like the formal legal name for this practice in Bosnia and Herzegovina is what's referred to as two schools under one roof. And two schools under one roof refers to the fact that in particular in areas with mixed Bosniak and Croat populations, though in other areas of the country as well, pupils will physically attend the same school, like the same building. The building itself, however, is often internally physically divided, including like the playgrounds. You'll put a fence or a wall. The kids will have slightly different schedules to ensure that they don't commingle, right? So they won't have recess at the same time. And they obviously have entirely different curricula, especially for what are the sort of controversial subjects like social studies, history, whatever, math and biology, you would think, are more or less equal for everyone. But generally, everything else is segregated. A colleague of mine who's at the University of Syracuse wrote a lovely article, and I hope no one will be horribly offended that I'm about to use a potty word. The title of the article is The Politics of Shit. And what it's about is that at that time when she wrote this article, she's an anthropologist, one of the only spaces, interestingly enough, that was not segregated in these schools were the bathrooms. And so, of course, kids being kids, the places where you would go to do all of the interesting things, like talk to the people that you're not supposed to talk to, and smoke and fall in love, and date people that you're not supposed to date, would happen in the bathrooms. And so bathrooms, became this kind of site of encounter and opposition and resistance, if we can use that language, to formal institutional segregation and separatism.
Yeah, and so when you think about new generations, which we're talking about, how do you as a society grow new generations under this segregation when they are still learning different aspects and different ways of history, right? How do you move forward as a society? And I know that's not even on our script, but like just something for us to really think about and ponder on. Like that's where we're at in our country.
Well, and I mean, I think obviously this topic for Americans is very, sort of conceptually pregnant because of the history of segregation in this country, and the fact that you had to use the power of the state ultimately to desegregate, a lot of spaces, and obviously, the legacies of Jim Crow and slavery and everything else are still, very much hang over American politics and American society. But the really interesting, and I would even say perverse part of the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that, at least at the sort of formal institutional level, all of these instances of segregation and separatism and sort of sectarianism, they are formally upheld by the international community, right? You can go to a lot of these segregated schools, and out front you'll find like a bust of MLK. Right, you'll find a bust of MLK, and then you'll go inside, and it's like, this school has been built by USAID, or is funded by the European Commission and development programs, and it's like, hang on, pretty sure MLK might have had a few things to say about the segregated school, right? All of which is to say is, at the sort of official political level, you'll definitely get American officials, European officials say, okay, we obviously want to see Bosnia and Herzegovina move towards international standards of rule of law, civic equality, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but when push comes to shove, and you say, okay, well, let's actually work on that. Let's actually do that. there is incredible hesitancy and even resistance to that. And the reason for that is, and it came up a little bit in the sort of quick chat we had about Rwanda, is that there's fear. There's fear that if you move towards structural political reform, you will reopen the prospects for conflict. My counterpoint is, as we see presently with Mr. Dodig, it's actually if you preserve these structures, that the logic of conflict is always there with you, right? Because if you have a divided society, politics remains permanently a zero-sum game. It's always either you or I. And it's only when you begin to create institutions and practices and norms that create as the baseline the idea of collective life and equality that you can actually begin to create change. So long as you insist on institutionally and politically separating people, they will, of course, continue to encounter each other as enemies or potential enemies.
I want to talk about also off the script, particularly the town of Srebrenica, which is held in control by Serbian authorities. Can you share maybe with this group how that plays out, like also with the schools, but how does that, where we have a memorial, a genocidal memorial to commemorate, the thousands of victims. Can you give a little bit of context how that has played out in the town?
So I'll say something, and you used the term civil war in your introductory comments. And so that's a term I myself don't use, and I think most survivors reject it as well. And I completely, this is not a knock on you, I just want to sort of talk it out. The reason why the term civil war is rejected is that from the perspective of most Bosnians, and really from the perspective of international law, there was an internal conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 1990s, but at least two of the three main combatant sides enjoyed direct political and military support from two neighboring states, Serbia and Croatia, right? And what is today this entity where Srebrenica is, the Republika Srpska entity, was a self-declared breakaway state during the 1990s. I used to have a lot of trouble explaining to people what the RS was conceptually, and then we had the good fortune, this is a very dark joke, that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and they created the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, which everyone recognizes as Russian occupation regimes, right? They're a fig leaf for Russian occupation, but they sort of have this purported political autonomy. That's what the RS was during the 1990s. There was also something during this period, which was the Croat nationalist equivalent of the RS. It was called the Herceg Bosna, that was essentially propped up by the Croatian government. It collapsed during the course of the war. The RS did not. That's itself a convoluted story as to why that didn't happen, because its parallel in Croatia, which was called the Republika Srpska Krajina, or the RSK, did collapse. And Croatia was allowed to liberate the entirety of its territory. Bosnia and Herzegovina ultimately was not. Nevertheless, in 1995, in November, December 1995, when the Dayton Agreement is negotiated, and just so this is clear, this might not actually be clear to everyone. It's called the Dayton Agreement because it was negotiated on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So there it is. When Dayton was negotiated, the RS was sort of legally recognized, but legally recognized only as an entity within the Bosnian state. And the Bosnian state did not gain independence in 1995. It was recognized as having existed prior to 1995, that it gained international recognition, which it did in 1992 at the UN. So these are all kind of finicky little legal topics. Point being, most of the places where the worst atrocities by Serb nationalist forces against Bosniak, but also Croat civilians took place during the 1990s, most of those places ended up in the RS. Srebrenica, Žepa, Foča, Prijedor, Banja Luka, Bijeljina, etc., etc. So those are all areas that in many cases had Bosniak majorities prior to 1992 that, as I explained, had virtually the entire population expelled or exterminated. Today, Srebrenica is a municipality within the RS entity. Even though it is a majority Bosniak area, for the past few years, it has generally been ethnic Serb candidates who have won at the elections. The reason for that is twofold. One, there's systematic electoral fraud, which is just openly known. And the other reason, which is a lot less well understood, is that there are also systematic attempts at voter intimidation and buy-offs, right? So I spend a fair bit of time in the community in and around Srebrenica. And you're talking about a community that if you were to go there, in February, it's very sparsely populated. In so much as you are going to encounter people, you are probably going to encounter ethnic Bosniaks. There are ethnic Serbs in the area, obviously, but they are actually a minority. When the elections roll around, ethnic Serb politicians and parties tend to win. That is also aided by the fact that if you are in Srebrenica, for instance, during election season, you will see a stream of buses coming in from where? Over the border in Serbia, which is right there, right? Srebrenica is right on the Drina River, and right across the Drina River is Serbia. And so you will get these convoys of buses coming in of people who live in Serbia and who suddenly find that they have Bosnian documents which allow them to vote in the elections. They'll vote, get back on the bus, you're given a sandwich, sometimes a little money, off you go. Right? And so Srebrenica is, it's the story of a community. I should say, the actual Bosniak populace in the RS entity is, from what we can gather, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 180,000 people. It's not a small population by Bosnian standards, right? Keep in mind that the Bosnian population as a whole is less than 3 million, probably. These are, people have recreated their communities as best as they have been able to, but they very much live under a hostile political regime, right? A political regime that not only systematically denies the facts of the genocide, not just in Srebrenica, but Bosnia as a whole. I'm just going to say something about that. I'll sideline it for the moment. But it's also actually a regime that has moved away from mere genocide denial. I think we used to talk about genocide denial and genocide revisionism for many years as concerned the government in Banja Luka and the RS entity. Over the past few years, we've increasingly started seeing what I think we would more adequately describe as genocide glorification, which is the sentiment that, yeah, it happened, and we'd like to do it again if at all possible, right? And sort of the day in which this is most obvious now is January 9th, which is in the RS entity, a public holiday, but a public holiday that has been struck down by the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the regime there disregards that. And so you get these kind of paramilitary parades that take place in Banja Luka in particular by the RS police. In past years, for instance, you've had the participation of the Night Wolves, both local chapters and chapters from Russia itself. You also had, for instance, various groups come in from South Ossetia and other occupied territories by Russia, right? In which the sentiment, or January 9th, purportedly marks the day of the founding of the RS, according to Serb nationalist historiography. It's contentious whether it's even that day, but it's increasingly become a day for celebrating the genocide, and that's best encapsulated not just by the paramilitary parades, but for instance, in other towns outside of Banja Luka, Visegrad in eastern Bosnia is another one of these towns right on the border with Serbia. Visegrad is famous for its 15th century Ottoman era bridge, the Mehmet Pasha Sokolovic Bridge. It's a beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Site. In 1992, it was the site where Serb paramilitaries moved Bosniak civilians, and on the bridge, they would slice their throats and throw them over the bridge. Right, so that portion of the Drina River became basically a mass grave, and we're still dredging up the bodies. Every January 9th now, Serb nationalist hooligans will do these pyrotechnic displays on the Mehmet Pasha Sokolovic Bridge, right? You could theoretically do it in other places in Visegrad, but it's very telling that this is the site. Now, the reason why I just wanted to sideline something, we talk a lot about the genocide in Srebrenica. Obviously, it was a genocide, but I wrote a book, and other folks have written about this as well. Increasingly, I think for the Bosnian community and for other scholars and analysts, we're definitively, and this is something you alluded to at the beginning, we're moving towards really rejecting not the idea that a genocide took place, but this exclusionary language of the genocide in Srebrenica. Folks in the community itself refer to this as the municipalization of genocide. And what they mean by that is that it's preposterous that we would focus exclusively on the events in Srebrenica, for instance, in July of 1995, but not on the events between 1992 and 1995. Or more importantly, that identical crimes committed by identical persons during the same exact conflict for the same political ends in Jepa, Prijedor, Foča, Bijeljina, are not part of that discourse. As well as the fact that you actually evacuate from the discourse that there are internationally binding legal decisions which refer to a genocide having taken place in places like Foča and Bijeljina, which were done, for instance, by German national courts in the early 2000s. Long story short, that the preferable terminology would be the genocide in Bosnia, or the Bosnian genocide, or the genocide against the Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina, et cetera, et cetera.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up to you all for questions, comments. So we know, as you mentioned, the situation currently that we're facing with Dodik. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear in our community. Many people are hesitant to even go back and visit this year, which a lot of the diaspora go back, during the summertime, and it's a very busy season for the country over there. So we know that right now there's a lot of uncertainty. How do we prevent another Bosnian genocide? How do we, you've alluded to a lot of that, but where do we go from here? What actions can people take, whether it's the international community or the Bosniak diaspora community to in this pivotal moment?
Well, first and foremost, conversations like this are part of it, right? Educating folks. That's always sort of the starting point. The second major thing is we are actually quite lucky in the United States in the sense that we have large concentrations of Bosnian Americans as well as other Balkan communities. And I've been somebody who's really worked on attempting to integrate Bosnian American communities, for instance, with Kosovar American communities, Albanian American communities, Montenegrin American communities, because I think they have a lot of shared interests and a lot of shared concerns. But over the past few weeks, we've actually heard and seen quite a bit of support from the US Congress for Bosnian institutions and Bosnian law enforcement. This is very important. We've had a lot of support from Senator Chuck Grassley because there's a huge Bosnian American community in Iowa. There's large Bosnian American communities in New York, Kentucky, Florida, Arizona, right? So in so much as you are, an American citizen and concerned about the situation in the Balkans and Bosnia, I would definitely urge you to reach out to your representatives, make your voices heard, perhaps reach out to various Bosnian American advocacy organizations which exist, the North American Congress of Bosniaks, for instance, USA BIH, and other groups which are doing a lot of this work. The big talking point, as I've just alluded to, is this, and again, this goes back to something that I was saying earlier, is, and I will say, we're unfortunately right now living through a moment where there's a lot of tensions between the EU and the US. for reasons that I'm not, going to go into right now. But it's actually been very interesting seeing both U.S. officials and EU officials pretty much speaking with a unified voice on Bosnia. I can't think of another issue right now in the world where we're seeing that, and that's very encouraging. And so the sort of the talking point really has to be that the preservation of the rule of law and support for law enforcement is absolutely critical at this time, because you can't let one guy tear up 30 years of peace, an imperfect peace though it may be, and I've spoken a lot today about how imperfect it is, but peace is preferable to conflict. And so you can't let one person who spends most of this time in Belgrade and Moscow jeopardize the peace and security, not just of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but the entire region, and realistically speaking, Europe. Because we're at a time where I don't think Europe can really afford yet another war on the continent. And so, this is very much a time for, I think, cooler heads to prevail and ensure that obviously Mr. Dodik not only is actually arrested, but then that he also has his day in court and, at least according to the law, should hopefully serve a prison sentence.
On that note,
That uplifting note.
we'll open it up for comments, questions. See one in the back.
Thank you for this presentation. I'm only going to refer to Malaysia because that's the closest I know to, the situation you're talking about. Having lived there for 15 years, it's a very authoritarian regime, that basically went into that from being a democratic state in many ways in the 80s. And of course, it's a big contrast to what I've known over here in America at first. Now it's a different story. But my point is that the same elements you spoke about, the segregated schools, the notion of a second-class citizen, you didn't really mention that per se, but we get it. And also the continuous imposition of the ethnic differences in the community. All these elements exist till today in Malaysia, and there's been a total brain drain. All the institutions have been weakened, and the country is in chaos. And I never felt free to be the scholar I am today and a writer I am today. So my question is, if this is what Bosnia seems to be like, with the differences, is there a need to maybe engineer incentives that are going to prompt the governing forces, including the legislative bodies, to make the amendments that you're talking about? Because the way I see it, so many countries, although it's antithetical to what we know today in America as being a free country where people are open to doing what they're doing, I think it's very possible for countries to remain in that state because it serves all the governing bodies. So can we engineer incentives? And what are these?
It's a very good question. And the irony is that Bosnia is a country that probably no country in the world, especially no post-conflict country, has as ready-made a solution as Bosnia has. For instance, Bosnia today has a unified armed forces. It has a state police. There's a singular license plate regime, which is important, which means that the numbers on license plates are random. So if you go to Banja Luka from Sarajevo, nobody can tell that you drove in from Sarajevo, and vice versa, right? This was very important for freedom of movement. There's a unified single currency regime. The reason why I mention all of this is because most of that happened between 1995 and 2006, which was the high watermark, not just of international engagement, but also it was a period in which the then a succession of high representatives, but most significantly a gentleman by the name of Patty Ashdown, Lord Ashdown, who's now deceased, a British parliamentarian, used the power of the OHR to integrate the state. Now, we can discuss to what extent that was perhaps problematic, using an office like the OHR to do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no question that was sort of the golden era of post-war Bosnia, where also very suddenly, within the span of 10 years, you had people going from war and genocide, systematic sexual violence, concentration camps, et cetera, to believing that EU membership was around the corner, because the pace of reform was so rapid and seemingly so unthinkable that it seemed very much possible. The problem is that the wheels very rapidly fell off of that, because the international community concluded that Bosnia was so successful that it no longer needed that kind of assistance and aid. And also then it turned out that the incentives that were built into the existing constitutional regime were such that it was actually smarter for local politicians to run to the extremes. And this is where we come back to Mr. Dodik. Mr. Dodik first enters Bosnian political life in 1998 as a reformer. Madeleine Albright famously refers to him as a breath of fresh air. Mr. Dodik repeatedly goes on public television, the public broadcaster of the RS entity and Bosnian national television, and says a genocide occurred in Srebrenica. Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic are war criminals, and Srebrenica is the blackest page in the history of the Serb people. Whoa. Within less than 5 years, he goes back on all of that. Why? Because he figures out that the incentives in a system that rewards sectarianism are not towards moderation, but towards extremism. And this is the conversation that I frequently have with my American counterparts or my European counterparts. Like, no, obviously it is not desirable that the international community should fix Bosnia. That's not what really anyone is asking for. But the fact of the matter is that the structure was imposed on Bosnia by the international community. And in order to move past it does require a modicum of assistance. Bosnians literally refer to the constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a straitjacket, right? And it's this idea that, like, yes, it gives you peace, but that's pretty much it. And it turns out that if you persist for so long in that kind of environment, as we're seeing presently, eventually you don't have peace either. So all of which is to say is, yes, I would agree with you. I think the U.S., for instance, and the U.K. have used a fairly robust sanctions policy against people like Dodik. I think that approach needs to be broadened. I've also been an advocate, which has sometimes horrified some of my friends and colleagues in Bosnia, that, for instance, weaponizing, essentially, for lack of a better term, international aid is something that needs to be talked about a lot more openly. The idea that you have a parasitic political class that depends in large part on funds that come in particular from the EU. Take them away. Take them away and say you're not getting them back until you make actual moves towards reform. And if you don't want to make the moves, good luck. Good luck. And see how long your populace sticks it out with you. But that's touch and go.
Other questions, comments? Ava? Yeah. And then we'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead, Ava.
We need, at least I need a little bit more of an historical arc here. When Yugoslavia was still a political entity, how did all the ethnic conflict, how were they resolved? How did they, was it just under the carpet, so to speak, or was it very much in the open? So give us some historical arc, the historical arc here to make sense of the complexity of the situation.
I'll say, this book in particular goes into more detail about that, at least from the perspective of sort of, shall we say, Bosniak national politics. The broader answer is that, obviously, for those of you that don't know, Yugoslavia during the Nazi occupation and fascist occupation period is essentially, in the midst of an internecine conflict, right? You have incredible atrocities that are committed, in particular by the Croatian puppet regime, the so-called independent state of Croatia, which was a Nazi puppet regime, that commits incredible atrocities, in particular against Jews, Roma, and ethnic Serbs. These are your famous death camps at Jasenovac, for instance. There's also a fascist puppet regime in Serbia, the Nejra regime, which is so successful in its pogroms of Jews that Belgrade claims to be, at that time, the first so-called Judenfrei city in Europe, i.e. that they've exterminated the entirety of the Jewish population, right? You then also to make the situation even more complex, you have, for instance, Serb nationalists who initially oppose the fascist occupation. These are the so-called Chetniks under Draža Mihailović, who then subsequently decide to collaborate with the fascists and the Nazis, including with the Ustasha, against the communist partisans. And they are also simultaneously, the Chetniks in particular, committing systematic atrocities against Bosnian Muslims / Bosniaks in eastern Bosnia. So for instance, in communities like Srebrenica and other parts of eastern Bosnia, and many Bosnians trace their family lineages to eastern Bosnia, such as my family, you can literally go, as a colleague of mine described it, you can talk to a single family or a single person in a family and find that 3 or 4 generations have all been targeted by Serb nationalists in the same villages, in the same towns, over the span of somewhere between 70 to 120 years, right? From the end of the Ottoman period through to the 1990s. During the communist period, the communists ultimately, are successful in creating a kind of multi-ethnic resistance force, liberation movement, et cetera, but it's an authoritarian regime, right? It's an authoritarian regime, the Yugoslav communist regime, and so you get attempts at something vaguely approximating what we would call truth and reconciliation, but it is very much from a kind of top-down state and politically directed narrative. Right. And so when certain aspects of that narrative are permissible and others are not, for instance, the Ustasha regime's crime against ethnic Serbs are permissible. And so you have a very beautiful and powerful memorial in Jasenovac, which was the primary Ustasha death camp, where something like 60 to 70,000 ethnic Serbs were exterminated by the Ustasha authorities, as well as tens of thousands of Jews and Roma and political prisoners. Crimes against the ethnic Bosniak community in eastern Bosnia by the Chetniks are not as favorably allowed. You can sort of occasionally mention it in a textbook, but you're certainly not going to have public commemorations of that. Why? In part because the upper echelons of the communist regime, especially in the 50s and 60s, are dominated by ethnic Serbs from Serbia and Montenegro. By the 1970s and 1980s, you get a little bit more liberalization of that regime. But in the interim, you have the death of Tito, the strongman leader of Yugoslavia. You have Yugoslavia entering a period of economic crisis, and the political regime begins to implode on itself. And all of these sort of various undercurrents of various ethnic and sectarian grievances come back to the fore. As unfortunately, I think we've discovered in this country and other democracies around the world, a little bit of economic pain often incentivizes sectarian politics, and people quickly fly off the rails. All of which is to say is, I don't think Yugoslavia was uniquely predisposed towards conflict, violence, and genocide, but the fact that it enters the 1980s, a period of significant social and economic crisis with an authoritarian regime, certainly didn't help matters.
The gentleman in the back had a question.
I stand up because otherwise you don't see me. I was in 2015. I was in basically in Bosnia. The usual places where you go when you are an academic and want to understand Srebrenica and Sarajevo and Mostar. And I go in and out when it has my attention or not. I currently have not fully kept up. So my question is, in a changing landscape with political alliances, no longer the Cold War, no longer the in-between period post fall of the Soviet Union. Where is the alt-right in Germany on this conflict? What are the political alliances? Who gets support from whom? Where is Orban? Where are the alt-right parties in relationship to this? Where is Putin in relationship to this? How is this playing out locally from what you can see?
It's a very good question. I'll answer the easy part first. Mr. Orban and Mr. Putin are lined up decisively behind the Serb nationalist cause in Bosnia. As I suggested, Mr. Dodik may very well end up in Budapest in the near future. As I said, he was just in in Budapest. He was just in Moscow. He was just in Belgrade. In general, Mr. Dodik and sort of the broader Serb nationalist movements has very close ties to the European far right, Marine Le Pen, the FPÖ in Austria, those kinds of movements. They have made significant overtures to some of the far right elements in the United States as well. That has gone less well, but it's unclear still. Rudy Giuliani was just in Banja Luka a couple of weeks ago and hosted Mr. Dodik on his podcast.
Is he looking to settle there?
No, Mr. Dodik is looking to hire him as a lobbyist. Just today, we found out that the secessionist authorities in Banja Luka have hired Mr. Rod Blagojevich as a lobbyist. So, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on down to this. The Serb nationalist camp has sort of definitely thrown themselves in league with the sort of, shall we say, broader authoritarian axis in sort of the world. The Croat nationalist camp in Bosnia and Herzegovina plays an interesting game. They actually have very robust ties to Russia. Mr. Čović, who's the leader of the HDZ, was in Moscow, for instance, in March of 2021, and bemoaned, quote unquote, the lack of Russian influence in Bosnia. Since then, they've really quieted down on that front, but it's known to still very much be current, and they maintain many of the same ties to some of these other far-right elements. To your question specifically about Germany, Mr. Dodik has ties to the AfD, which you will not be surprised to learn about. The question of his relationship with the broader German sort of conservative right, Christian Democrats, is a lot more complex. Christian Schmidt, who's the High Representative, is very, very close to the Croat nationalist camp in Bosnia. He has repeatedly intervened on their behalf, most controversially in October of 2022 during the Bosnian general elections. 15 minutes after the polls closed, Mr. Schmidt changed the relevant election laws, including one of the constitutions of one of the regions of Bosnia-Herzegovina, thereby changing the way votes were tabulated exclusively on behalf of the local Croat Nationalist Party. We don't yet know what the current CDU sort of orientation will be exactly. We are led to believe at this time that Germany will become the first European EU state to impose sanctions on Dodik within the next 2 weeks or so, potentially as soon as tomorrow, based on some of the conversations that I've had. But it remains unclear. So it's a fluid situation. And I will say that it's not sort of helped by the fact that Bosnia as an institutional entity, as a legal state, and the self-identifying Bosnian and Bosniak populaces, they don't really have any obvious allies. There are states that purport to sort of be friendly. Turkey is the classic one, but Turkey is not actually particularly involved in Bosnia. And beyond that, it's pretty much slim pickings, at least in an official sense. There's a lot of individual parliamentarians and legislators who are passionate about these issues. Alicia Kearns, for instance, in the UK, Jean Shaheen here in the United States is traditionally somebody who's been sort of good on Bosnia. But yeah, it's pretty chaotic.
I think there's a question over here.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. And thank you. I'm from Poland, so not so far from
Yes.
different situation. So my question is, you spoke so eloquently about policy, about international relationships, kind of top-down approach. Sure. Could you tell us a little bit more about public opinion? Sure. Bosniaks, what they think? Sure. How do they see their historical trajectory from the past, the present, and the future?
It's a very good question. I'll say my first book was essentially about social movements in the Balkans, so it deals with that a lot more. But one of the good pieces of news right now in Bosnia is actually that the Serb population of Bosnia including the Serb ethnic opposition parties in the RS entity, are uniformly opposed to what Mr. Dodik is doing. It is the saving grace of Bosnia right now, because I tell you honestly that if that was not the case, if there had been the kind of rallying around the flag effect that many fear, we might already have a conflict. The fact that the Serb opposition parties in the RS have actually been some of the most outspoken advocates for Dodik's arrest and trial is huge, including, this is where it gets amazing, including the main opposition party in the RS, which is the SDS party, which was the party of Radovan Karadzic, i.e. the architect of the genocide, right? So when the SDS today talks about Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnian state institutions, Bosnian courts, Bosnian police, right? That's good. That's good. The reality of the situation is, though, this is still very much a captured regime, and it's not a place where, there's a lot of room for public participation or public discontent. We may at some point see the manifestation of protests against Dodik. We have at previous times. What will be the camel that breaks the back? We don't know. The short answer to your question is he does not enjoy public support for what he's doing. That has never stopped him before. And as we know, as scholars, authoritarian regimes don't necessarily rely on public support. Oftentimes they will create public support, right, when needed, as Mr. Putin and others have done. But I will say that, it is good news for Bosnia that there is a significant segment of the Serb populace that is opposed to it. Now, let me be very clear, just as a final point. These folks are still people who almost uniformly would identify as Serb nationalists, who valorize Karadzic, who valorize Milosevic, but at this point in time are not in favor of a new war in Bosnia. And for the time being, that's good enough, right?
Yeah, and I think also to add to that, the current situation that's playing out in Serbia is not helping Dodik either, which is a mass movement of youth and young adults who are protesting, have been protesting since November now against the government, against Vučić, and recently the prime minister had to step down because of that. And so that's not helping because Vučić and Dodik are good buddies. And so it's just not looking good because I think there is legitimate concern that there might be the same uprise in the bordering country of Bosnia as well. Yeah.
Okay, we have a bit of a conundrum here. It's 4:33. There's an event in this room at 5, and I got 3 online questions. So I'm gonna lob them all at you.
Okay, and I'll be very quick.
Yeah, you can address them all quickly, or if there's one you like,
Sounds good.
Go for it. Okay, question number 1. Do you believe that the passing of Tito played a crucial role in unifying Yugoslavia alongside the dissolution of the Soviet Union? Significantly influenced the outbreak of the conflict?
Okay. Short answer, yes. Long answer, no. Which is to say that, yes, it was definitely a factor. The longer and slightly more substantive answer is that I reject narratives that say it was a foregone conclusion. I think there was many exit ramps for Yugoslavia, for Bosnia after 1980, before 1992. But in retrospect, it was definitively a factor. It was not a decisive factor, but it was a factor.
Okay, and that question was from Tim O'Toole, and very impressed. But I was succinct. Next question from David Cater. This segregated educational system for kids sounds dreadful, but leads me to ask how integrated is the commerce of the same community? Which leads to the mingling of persons, including kids. Can the wider culture, in short, defeat the segregated school?
Excellent question. Bosnian commerce, which is to say the Bosnian economy, is surprisingly integrated. If you hang out in the city of Sarajevo proper, as perhaps some of you have done, you will know that what's called the inter-entity boundary line, this is the line that divides the two main entities, right? It runs through part of Sarajevo proper. You can sit in a cafe where the boundary is, and every single morning, what you will see are a stream of cars coming in from the what's known as East Sarajevo or Eastern Sarajevo, which is in the RS entity and is predominantly Serb, into Sarajevo proper, which is the main city and is in the Federation. Why? Because ethnic Serbs who live in the RS entity near Sarajevo almost uniformly work, shop, etc. in Sarajevo, because the standard of living is much higher. In that sense, there is a little bit of the, hand of the market at work here. The problem is that the respective political regimes continuously impose barriers to this kind of, so for instance, taking a cab from Sarajevo to East Sarajevo involves the cabbie stopping at the boundary line, taking off the taxi sign, and then going on because he doesn't want to be stopped by the RS police because he's got a Sarajevo taxi license, but not an RS license, right? So this kind of nonsense. But all of which is to say is the good news is actually, I think, commerce, enterprise, free movement of people is one of the integrationist forces in Bosnia. The political regime is a disintegration force.
Yeah, impressive. Not the class for academics. How to succinctly answer difficult questions. And finally, from Kim Klett, who's a retired teacher who does genocide education in the Phoenix area. Kim saw that the genocide memorial in Srebrenica was closed in early March for security reasons around Dodik's arrest. Do you know if it is still closed?
As far as I know, so I'm going to be in Bosnia in about a week. And I'm planning to go to Srebrenica. As far as I know, yes, it is still closed. And that is because of this situation with Mr. Dodik and his secession attempts. The director of the Srebrenica Memorial Center, who's a good friend of mine, Emir Suljegić, who is himself, of course, a survivor of the genocide, took the decision to close the memorial center in protection of his staff and other community members who work at the memorial center, because obviously they understood that there was a high probability that if the situation escalated, the memorial center would be a target, not just for official regime police and others, but local Serb nationalist elements. I'll just say as a final point, for instance, you may or may not know that every single July 11th, after the commemorations and the burials at the Genocide Memorial have completed, every single July 11th, the nearest Serb Orthodox church will loudly ring its bells, play turbo folk music, and the local presiding Serb Orthodox priest, who's also a kind of would-be paramilitary leader, he often poses with guns and such, he will lead a procession through the street, because the way the memorial is set up, you have a street running through it, here's the graveyard, and here's the actual memorial center. So there's a street running through it. So he'll lead a procession of folks waving Serb flags, playing music, firing pistols, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, as of right now, the memorial center is still closed.
Impressive. Sort of those multi-layered questions, 3 of them in 4.5 minutes. So that's going to conclude this panel. Let's give a round of applause for the panelists. And, I love what you did with this. Like it's, an important commemorative year and anniversary, but how you tied in the present moment. And as you said, things get lost in this news cycle because it's just an inundation of everything. So thank you for that.
Thank you for the space.
Appreciate having you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nita.